7% of US adults experience social anxiety disorder every year. And that number already tells you something uncomfortable. This is not rare enough to feel special, and not common enough to make people stop and talk about it properly. It lives in the middle space where you can hide it behind personality and call it just being a bit quiet. That is the trick. You do not feel afraid of people. You feel afraid of what they might decide about you. So you start deciding first. You know the ritual. The message arrives, or the invitation, or the simple sentence, "We should all get together." Suddenly you are standing inside your own head like it is a conference room with bad lighting. You replay the last thing you said. You wonder if you looked bored. You wonder if that pause made you seem cold. You read into one tiny laugh like it was a verdict. And while everybody else has moved on with their day, you are still there drafting an invisible report about yourself. Not because anyone asked, because you did. That is why social fear is so exhausting. It does not just make a room feel large. It makes your own mind feel hostile. You are not only trying to talk, you are trying to monitor, edit, and grade yourself at the same time. And the worst part is that the grading begins before anyone else has even opened their mouth. You have already written the bad review. I did this last week. I opened a note on my phone with a title that was supposed to help me prepare for a conversation, and somehow I spent 10 minutes rewriting the title instead. That sounds small until you realize how familiar it is. The content disappears. The preparation becomes a performance. The mind keeps reaching for control in the most useless places. Researchers at Dalhousie University found something that makes this even harder to dismiss. In a study of 6,825 people, aged 16 to 29 in 7 countries, 1 in 3 met the criteria for social anxiety disorder. 1 in 3, which means this is not some strange corner of human behavior reserved for a tiny group of people in the back row. It is sitting in the middle of ordinary life, in classrooms, offices, group chats, and kitchens. The limitation is simple. That study focused on a specific age range, so it does not describe everyone. But for a huge number of young people, the fear is not a personality quirk. It is the background noise. And background noise changes everything because it trains you to treat harmless moments like evidence. Someone takes a while to reply, and you start building a case. Someone says fine, and you hear cold. Someone looks away for 1 second, and you feel the floor move. That is not sensitivity. That is self-surveillance. You become both the person on trial and the person writing the notes. A little like carrying a flashlight that keeps turning inward. Useful for finding nothing. Terrible for living. What gets lost first is usually your attention. Not in some dramatic way, in practical ways. You forget what was actually said because you were busy tracking how your face looked while it was being said. You leave conversations with no memory of the content, only the aftertaste. You reread the same sentence in an email because your brain was somewhere else, checking whether your last sentence at lunch sounded weird. Then the consequences spread outward. You miss the point of a meeting because you are rehearsing your next line. You send the apology that was never needed. You skip the call. You let the opportunity sit there until someone else takes it. And still, the most corrosive part is that you often do not even recognize it as fear. That is what another Dalhousie University finding makes painfully clear. In the same study, 1 in 6 participants met the criteria for social anxiety disorder without realizing it. They thought it was just their personality. That matters because once you call it personality, you stop looking at it. You build an identity around the very thing that is shrinking your life. You say, "I'm just like this," and then you start arranging your days to fit the cage. That sentence is familiar because it sounds modest. It sounds accepting. It sounds almost wise. But it can also be a very elegant way of never asking whether the version of you that avoids everything is actually you, or just the habit of protecting yourself from imagined judgment by judging yourself first. And once you see that, a lot of behavior starts to look less mysterious. The over-explaining, the rehearsed joke, the 3 edits to a text message that was already fine. The way you arrive early so you can spend 10 quiet minutes convincing yourself to walk in. The way you leave feeling like you performed badly, even if nothing happened. You were not awkward. You were busy writing a review of yourself that nobody asked for. That review has a cost, and it is not abstract. It steals chances because it makes ordinary risk feel like public exposure. It turns a coffee invitation into a test. It turns speaking up into a gamble with your identity. It can keep you out of rooms where your work, your friendships, and your actual life are waiting. It also costs time in the most insulting way possible. Not in one dramatic hour. In fragments. In the half hour spent pacing before a call, in the 15 minutes after the call spent replaying one word. In the evening, that becomes a post-mortem instead of a rest. The NIMH puts another hard edge on this. 7% of US adults experience social anxiety disorder every year, and 12% will experience it at some point in their lives. The limitation is that these numbers describe diagnosis. Not every quiet person who feels dread before social contact. But they still tell you this fear is not a rare glitch. It is a recurring part of adult life for millions, which means the shame around it is doing extra damage. You are not only carrying the fear, you are carrying the idea that you should not have it. That second burden is often what keeps the whole thing alive. Because if every awkward pause becomes a moral failure, then every interaction turns into a court case. You stop trying to connect and start trying to avoid being found out. And avoidance has a sneaky way of pretending to help while making the world smaller. You say no to the dinner and you get temporary relief. You skip the message and your heartbeat settles. You avoid the presentation and the panic passes. For a moment, it looks like the system works. But then the circle gets tighter. The next invitation feels larger. The next conversation feels more dangerous. The small retreat teaches the mind that escape was the only safe move. That is why the answer cannot be just be confident. Confidence is not the first move. The first move is to stop feeding the inner judge every single second. Not by forcing yourself to like every room. By refusing to act as if every room is an exam. The shift is small, but it has teeth. When you catch yourself rehearsing a conversation in advance, do not polish it. Say the first honest sentence you actually want to say. When you feel the post-event replay begin, do not stay for the full verdict. Name the moment and leave it there. One thing you noticed, not the whole trial. It helps to think of it like a smoke detector that is too sensitive. You do not solve it by listening harder. You solve it by checking what kind of signal it is and then resetting your response. Or like carrying a backpack with a false bottom. It feels like you are holding one bag, but part of the weight is hidden where you keep forgetting to look. Social fear works like that. The weight is not only the social moment, it is the extra layer of commentary you keep adding on top of it. So here's the practical shift that starts to loosen it. Before any social moment that usually scares you, write down the exact thing you think will happen. Not a vague dread, the actual sentence. They will think I'm boring. I'll sound stupid. I'll be left out. Then after the moment is over, do not ask whether you were impressive. Ask whether that sentence came true, not whether you felt bad, whether the prediction happened. That matters because your fear is expert at mistaking feeling exposed for being exposed. The two are not the same, and once you separate them, the self-review loses some of its authority. You can also make one quiet rule for yourself. No interpreting the same moment more than once. If you already decided that a pause meant nothing, you do not get to reopen the case an hour later. If you already answered the message, you do not get to rewrite the tone in your head all night. This works because social fear feeds on repetition. It survives by making you revisit ordinary interactions until they feel loaded. Cut the repetition and the event gets smaller. Not painless, smaller. And yes, there will still be nights when you get home and think about the one sentence you wish you had said differently. That is human. But if you keep treating that feeling as proof, you will keep building a life around a misunderstanding. The goal is not to become someone who never feels awkward. The goal is to stop making awkwardness into evidence. That you are at risk of being dismissed by everyone in the room. Because most of the time, the room is not doing what you think it is doing. The room is not scoring your performance. The room is being a room. People are looking for their own water, their own words, their own exit. They are not waiting to deliver the verdict you have been rehearsing all day. That does not make the fear fake. It makes it lonely. You have been carrying a judgment that is heavier than the actual audience. And maybe that is the hidden cruelty of it. Social fear does not protect you from judgment. Just make sure you judge yourself before anyone else gets the chance. The rest of the evening becomes an argument with a reviewer who was never real enough to deserve that much attention. 7% of US adults experience social anxiety disorder every year. And somewhere in that number is the person rereading a message that was already fine.